Well, first of all, thanks very much for that introduction, Steve, and I'd like to thank Sitecore for inviting me here today. What I'm going to talk about is something called the personal touch, and it actually, serendipitously, I think, picks up on some of the comments made already, particularly by Simon earlier on. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of research that we've done for Sitecore via their PR agency, and share some of the results with you. Happy to take questions at the end, by the way, but I'm just going to try and breeze through this stuff now for you. Firstly, a little bit of kind of history and background. So let's rewind the clock. There was a time when relationships with customers were dealt with on a one-to-one personal basis. Some of you might recognize the advert at the top left. Any ideas, anybody? The man from the Prue, thank you. And bottom right, we have obviously a slight caricature, but it's Captain Mannering, the local bank manager from the Home Guard. So there was a time when relationships that customers had with service providers were entirely personal. But things have changed significantly. Corporations have fundamentally changed their approach to building and maintaining customer relationships. They've developed approaches to delivering services and products which have moved away from the personal approach towards a high-volume, minimum contact approach, which we're all painfully familiar with these days. Consumers have a lot more choice. There is much less customer loyalty, and there's been a consumerism revolution. So if you think about your own life, the interactions that you have with suppliers, the companies and organisations listed on your bank statement when you see it, there will be dozens probably. And what's more, they'll probably be different next year. We now deal with anonymous call centres. We can buy our groceries without the need to speak to a human being, where communication has been reduced to a series of beeps. And we buy our insurance through websites. So things have changed. What's more, we're engaged in a war for attention. The changes that have occurred have not just been about relationships, they have been about content and information. So as the providers of goods and services, we're engaged in this war. We live in an age of information overload. There's a huge amount of noise, and consumers have to fight their way through this. There's now so many platforms, channels, and so much information routed through those channels that much of the marketing and PR emitted is just pure noise. In researching this speech, I even came across a field of economics called attention economics, which is an approach to the management of information that treats human attention as a scarce commodity. I'm sure you'll all be extremely familiar with that. There are a couple of other changes that I want to talk to you about quickly before moving on to the research. The first is that back in the day of Captain Mannering, relationships were private. Letters were written. But now they're very much public, and they're often played out in front of a massive audience. The volume of information exchanged in those relationships used to be low, but now it's huge. And of course, it's digital platforms that have driven these two fundamental shifts. So the nature of our relationships have changed, and we're in a war for consumers' attention. So what do we do? I came across an article in Forbes magazine by the authors of a book called The Impact Equation, and they suggest that there are two ways to capture consumers' attention online. The first is through delivery of content that is entertaining, interesting, or helpful. And the second, and this is where I really want to dwell, is through being more personable than your competitors, by creating resonance with your customers and by showing that you are one of them and that you care about them. Building a sense of community is seen as crucial, where people can feel seen and heard. So creating two-way communication channels that build trust, create that resonance, and broaden reach are central to successful customer relationship development and retention. But if social media allows the opportunity for consumers to praise and criticize in public, then it also affords the opportunity for companies and organizations to stimulate praise, respond to criticism, rectify problems, and to build that trust, resonance, and reach. So as with so many things, we're experiencing a cycle. Relationships at the personal level are becoming increasingly important again. So I'm here today because I managed a research project for Sitecore via their PR agency, which was about exploring whether businesses that communicated with customers in particular ways perform better than others. After all, what we're all trying to achieve is a maximum return on our investment in marketing, PR, and communications, and by developing and sustaining customer relationships through whatever mechanism. We thought this was an interesting question. We were very happy to do the work, and we were very happy to be effectively given a free hand to design the study, which was effectively to test the hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that businesses that communicate in particular ways and display and undertake two-way personal level communication with their audience display demonstrably different business performance. That was the hypothesis. We were asked to design a research process to test it. The next few slides are about that research project and some of the results. There were three key research questions. The first is, if there is a concept called the personal touch, what is it and what are its benefits? Has there been a growing trend for companies to follow this approach? And do companies that use the personal touch perform better than their peers? So what is the personal touch? Well, the personal touch is about a two-way communication and an interaction with an audience. It's between an organization and their community, their stakeholders. So again, picking up on something Simon said earlier. That could be clients, it could be voters, it could be suppliers. And it involves a minimum of one leader from that organization directly involved in that interaction. So there are a number of drivers, I should just mention before we go on to findings, behind the personal touch. So these are brand and reputation management, customer interaction, a realization that effective communication can make a direct contribution to the delivery of strategic objectives. The emergence of social media as a platform through which to conduct communications is also key, along with the opportunity to build a personal touch into those communications in order to create a community spirit and a resonance with the audience. So what did we find? Well, first of all, we found that only 7% of the businesses that we studied followed this thing called the personal touch. The businesses that we studied were about 116 B2C businesses from the FTSE 100 plus the FTSE 250. So we weeded out B2B, and we stuck with some of the largest businesses in the UK, and we also weeded out any listed businesses that effectively didn't operate in the UK. And we did that for two reasons. One is because it's easy to find business performance data for those businesses, and it's also easy to find data that helps you assess the extent to which leaders in those businesses interact through social media with their audience. So it seemed like an obvious place to start. I guess furthermore, they're household names, the sorts of businesses that we all recognise, and some of them indeed are Sitecore's clients. So 7% use the personal touch. We found that, and that was 8 out of our 116 companies, we found that 3 of those businesses were what we called super personal touch companies. And they were elevated slightly above because the leaders actually used multiple social media channels in order to conduct that communication. We also found, though, that there's another 20% of businesses in our sample where leaders were involved, but it was much more a one-way form of communication. So it's the emission of corporate messages, but not much reaction and interaction with that audience. I think the challenge there is to modify that interaction, the nature of that interaction, in order to elevate it up to the sort of levels of the personal touch. We'll come on to the benefits of that in a minute. We also found that the benefits of the personal touch are not widely appreciated. I think that's just really evidence in the fact that so few operate in this way. I think it would be easy to assume that businesses that are perhaps following more progressive approaches to this sort of thing are new. But actually we found that a lot of them have been around a long while. They're adapting and changing to the environment. We also found that the leaders involved in these personal touch companies have been in post for around 5 years. So again, they're not especially new. They're not just parachuting in and bringing these approaches with them. However, I think it's fair to say that these approaches must tie in to the personal ambitions and approach of the chief exec or chair or whoever it was we deemed to be the leader in these circumstances. And lastly, we looked at the key tools for engaging on this communication, the main social media channels, of which Twitter was probably by far and away the most significant. Okay, so on to kind of the effect that we found on business performance. First of all, we found that businesses that engage in two-way communication perform better than those that don't, both in terms of profit, share price, turnover, employee retention, and pretty much every measure that we looked at. We also found, we've obviously been through a very difficult trading period with the recession. We also found that the businesses that employed the personal touch approach bounced back from the recession much quicker and much more effectively than the non-personal touch companies. So clearly, the inference being that the level of engagement and the nature of the relationship that's facilitated by this approach is positively influencing business performance. We also found that because we looked at the periods before current chief exec or chair was in place and that before, and we found that adopting this approach via those individuals at least maintained and in most cases improved the performance of those companies. And the performance gap between businesses operating a two-way communication approach and the personal touch widens as soon as those personal elements are introduced. And finally, future projections of business performance for businesses operating the personal touch were more positive than others. So there's clearly some form of relationship between this approach to communicating and interacting with the corporate audience that influences performance. I think, moreover, the personal touch is actually part of a much wider and more progressive approach to interacting with that audience. It's not a silver bullet as such, but it's actually an articulation and an implementation of a particular culture. So these were the 8 out of the 116 organisations and individuals that we classified as operating the personal touch. And the top 3 there were the 3 that I referenced earlier on as super personal touch companies. Incidentally, I'm sure you're very familiar with these, but we use tools like Google Trends and Social Mention, as well as scouring and looking for each company and for each chief exec or chairperson at personal and corporate Twitter, Facebook, YouTube channels, and so on and so forth. But we found those tools incredibly insightful, actually, just in terms of sort of describing the difference between the impact that a chief exec or a chair of a personal touch type company has above and beyond their peers. I think one of the reasons I wanted to add in that third column there was just to give you a feel for the fact that this, there's no sort of clear sectoral trends here. Some of the sectors that these businesses operate in have clearly been significantly hit by the recession. But this approach has helped them bounce back from that difficult trading period. I just want to tell you a little bit about two of the people at the top of that list. Firstly, Mickey Arison. So Mickey Arison, what he doesn't do is he doesn't have a personal blog. He doesn't seem to have a blogging profile of any significance. He doesn't have a personal Facebook page, and in fact, there's no corporate Facebook page for Carnival anyway, or at least there wasn't when we did this research in late 2012. He does, however, have a personal Twitter account. At the time, he had 88,000 followers, which is more than Carnival had itself in the corporate Twitter account. And there's lots of evidence in the way that Mickey Arison interacts with Twitter of two-way interaction. You can see it there. Angela Arendts from Burberry, soon to be Apple. Again, she doesn't have a personal blog, but she blogs in other places. She doesn't have a personal Facebook page. There is a corporate one, but she does have a reasonably significant personal Twitter account with, at the time, 14,800 followers against 1.5 million for Burberry. So a small percent, 1%, if you like, and no personal YouTube channel. But I think this is the interesting thing. If you look at what she does through her Twitter account, it is interaction of a particular form, which I think is interesting and illustrative. She doesn't talk about Burberry. What she does is she engages with her audience around subjects that audience are interested in. It might be training, it might be fashion, but it isn't about Burberry, ostensibly. Another article I read was, again in Forbes, with an interview with Chief Exec of Starbucks. And the interviewer commented on how the fact that coffee had not actually been discussed in any way during the length of that interview. And in fact, when investment was sought, because obviously Starbucks has been around since the 70s, when investment was sought, the discussion with investors was not about coffee. It was about creating a third place between home and office, which is a much more interesting proposition. And lastly, a sort of very kind of reasonably current example, Peter Pester, who's the new CEO of TSB. In some of the interviews I've read with him, he talks about the importance of two-way communication and how that has helped them overcome and deal with the significant change that the customers of previously Lloyds TSB underwent in converting across to the new bank. So there are some key behaviours going on here. The first is that they use personal channels and they don't engage about the business of their company. It's also not entirely necessary to engage, for these individuals to engage with the corporate channels that they have. And it's also not entirely necessary for them to engage with multiple channels. But what they do incredibly well. They do it in a very two-way, interactive way. And they engage with their audience around subject matters that the audience is interested in. So just some concluding remarks. So in the battle for consumers' attention, we need to create great content, but we also need to engage customers and stakeholders at a personal level. Sorry, I keep doing that. We need to aim to develop a culture that builds trust, resonance, and reach, and to make customers feel like we are interested in the things that interest them. And social media obviously offers huge opportunities to do this, but building personal relationships is a key plank of that. And our research, I think, very much evidences that there are benefits to be gained. However, the personal touch is part of a wider approach. It's not a silver bullet in itself. Two-way communication is key. The interaction of leaders in that is also key. It's been mentioned today that high-level sponsorship of digital marketing strategies within corporate strategy is very important. this research, I think, suggests that high-level engagement in that is also very important. I think the other important thing is that social media has opened up channels which were only available to a very small number of organisations before, TV and radio and so on. So that opportunity needs to be maximised, and it can be part of a wider approach to customer engagement. And lastly, the evidence that we produce suggests that it produces results. And if this talk provides anyone in the audience with some ammunition that they may need to go and persuade people back in HQ that a bit more engagement with this is important, then I hope at least it's done that. So thank you very much for listening. Happy to take any questions now. I'm also hanging around for most of the rest of the afternoon. Anyone got any questions? Stunned you into silence. No? I think it's certainly it has been discussed with contacts at Sitecore that the research that we did can be shared. So if anyone has got any further questions, they can either contact me direct or go back to Sitecore. And if you're really bored one evening, perhaps you'd even read the report. But thanks very much for listening.